Hello, everyone, and welcome to Darling Discussions. Today in the studio, I have Susan Rhodes and Amanda Ibanez. Right? Did I say that right?
Ibanez.
Ibanez.
It's
there
okay.
we go.
Everybody messes it up. It's okay.
Susan and Amanda are both LCSW's licensed clinical social workers. And Susan and her husband Jeff own Connection to Recovery, which is where Amanda and I practice out of. So, Susan, why don't you tell the audience a little bit about Connection to Recovery?
Sure. Connection to Recovery started out as Jeff and myself wanting to serve the communities or people impacted by addiction. And so that was going to be our niche. That was all we were going to serve: families, addicts, alcoholics. And this was way before pandemic time, and it was all telehealth at the time. And so what happened was, so this started a few years before the pandemic. Then the pandemic hit, and the boom, of course, the need for mental health and telehealth services was, obviously mounting. So we expanded our services and opened up the practice to a wealth of things to help or serve people or folks with. We still help folks with addiction or alcoholism, but depression, anxiety, grief, adjustment issues, stress. Gosh, am I missing anything big there? Children,
Parenting,
adults, couples. Yes, we do. I think the full 9 yards, the full gamut of services, and trauma work. So we accept almost all insurances. We're taking patients now, and unless there's another piece there, that's the basic rundown.
Yeah. So if you're in person in the Waco area, or you can go telehealth if you're anywhere in the state of Texas.
And we do face-to-face in China Spring, and of course telehealth for all of Texas.
Yeah. Well, thanks for telling everybody a little bit about that, because you summed it up a lot better than I could have.
I hope I did.
Today's topic that we're discussing is grief. And good grief, there's a lot to talk about. In fact, we are not going to cover everything in just one podcast. There's going to be a part 2 and maybe a part 3. Let's see how that goes with part 2. As always, before we dive in today, I want to, tell everybody in our audience, if you're watching this and you start getting triggered by something, take a moment and take some deep breaths before you continue on. Or if you just need to skip this for today, that's fine. Do what's best for you. Practice good self-care, okay? So to just dive right in, Amanda, why don't you tell us what causes grief?
Absolutely. So I think when we talk about grief, the biggest thing we think of is a death, right? An actual loss of a person, of a life. But it's so much more than that, right? Grief expands to so many more things. Obviously a death is very significant. But a lot of the education I feel like I do in practice is explaining to patients that it can go so much further than this, right? So when we're talking about the loss of health, right? If there's a diagnosis, or we talk about like loss of ability, physical ability, mental ability, things like that. Divorce, right? So not just for kids, but for the couple themselves. And it doesn't have to just be divorce. It could be a loss of any significant relationships. I think of like friendships or partnerships, any kind of relationship. Job loss is a big one. Especially, I feel like through COVID, I saw a lot of this. I don't know about you guys, but the like transitions that weren't necessarily on that person's terms, right? And so kind of being forced out of a job or forced to retire or things like that, when it may be overall okay financially, but that wasn't that person's decision. So
do you see it whenever people have lost their job and they chose to leave that job?
Yeah, I still think like even retirement, right, can cause a lot of symptoms of grief, of like kind of the loss of that, the loss of what you did daily, right? A little bit of the depression symptoms of like, okay, what do I do? How do I do these things daily? So absolutely, it can definitely be if it was a choice as well, but especially if that wasn't necessarily something you envisioned. And I think also this kind of loss of ideas, right? So loss of like how you may have seen the future, or loss of things that you had desired, things like that. And that can, span lots of different things.
Right, that could be almost anything.
Yeah.
So if anything can cause grief, then how do we know it's grief, Susan?
So Grief is so tricky and complex, but I think some of the basic things would be an increase in apathy, loss of interest in regular activities, people, relationships, just apathetic,
Okay,
chronically.
It took me a long time before I knew what the word apathy was. It was in college, actually. Yeah. Can you give us a good definition of apathy?
Oh boy, I'm not a dictionary. Okay, but I'll tell you my definition. Just kind of there. Like, I'm not excited about it. I'm not gonna fight doing that, but I'm not gonna jump to do that activity.
So it's kind of like blah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great way to summarize it. Just feeling blah. And maybe we normally got excited about, I'll use a personal example, decorating and just doing things in the house. And I know for me, I went through a long window and season of grief, and I didn't want to do anything in the house. I mean, I'm talking years worth. And so it's funny, my husband didn't catch this, but I said, I want to paint the walls. Mm-hmm. And here we are probably 5 years into something, and I wanted to paint. And that was so I was apathetic to whatever. I just get the dishes done, just whatever. Mm-hmm. Put the couch up if you need to, and the flowers if we get flowers. But those were things I did normally all the time. And I took pride and joy in that. So the day I decided I'm going to paint, I'm going to go ahead and paint these walls finally. That was a big day. I suddenly felt, not suddenly, but it just felt excitement over doing something for my house. Right. So when you can go in this, and I'm not talking about a day of this kind of feeling blah, but this chronic pattern of, I just don't want to do my normal stuff. And if we get excited, maybe it's a little fraction of it, but it's not like it used to be. And again, there's more common, sometimes more obvious. We're sad, maybe we're depressed, we're crying more. Retreating within, isolating from others, apathetic again, just more irritable, more anxious, more, and I like to note burnout, like the things that we find joy in doing at work are suddenly, and we're more irritable and snappy at coworkers and again, family members. I like to add just kind of a physically, just more headaches, our body aches more. We're just sluggish.
You saying burnout actually at work and talking about with the grief being, loss of job or something. Also, it could be, especially during the pandemic, the people who were considered essential workers, the people who had to stay there, but everybody was cutting back. You might have been grieving some of your coworkers too, because now all of a sudden you've got their job plus your job, and you don't have the jokes and the laughter and the camaraderie that you had before. Yeah. So that could be part of that whole burnout as well.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And the grief and burnout kind of join together, and it's not fun times. So we've got the feeling apathetic, which thanks for defining that. The blah.
Right. There's my fancy clinical definition. Blah.
Yeah. Okay. And irritable and anxious, and there are these different stages. It's not just the sadness too. Amanda, why don't you talk about some of the stages of grief?
Yeah. So I will note the 5 kind of ones that everybody knows, right? They're the old school definition, or old school Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. So they are denial, anger, bark. I have to count every time. Me too. Every time I explain it to someone, I'm like, I always miss one, right? So denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Do we want to talk a little bit about each of those? What can come with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So denial, a lot of like typical behaviors that will come with that are like avoidance, confusion, shock, fear. Is this real? Did this really happen? Kind of waking up, not knowing if it's reality at times. The anger, that can come kind of like Susan was talking about as well, with more anxiety, more irritability, and a lot of frustration about what happened, right? Whether it's the death or loss of any of these other things. The bargaining, right? Struggling to find meaning through this, and really going back and forth with that. Wondering, like, is there something I could have done differently? And all of those thoughts that come up in that section. And then depression. So that's, again, kind of what we've already talked about, the mood changes, right? So the low mood, the apathy, the lack of interest in doing things. It may even look like not doing things like self-care, like, and I mean basic self-care, like showering or getting out of the house or communicating with loved ones, things like that, taking our medications, things to take care of ourselves, and then acceptance. And so this one is always tricky. I like to talk about this one as like exploring new options, seeing the future a little bit more clearly, right? And kind of moving forward. I don't like the word moving on, but like moving forward in that direction. So
right. I want to go back to the denial, because the denial always gets me. Because I was always been like, well, how can you, and I feel like a lot of times when I see clients that are still in that denial, they don't really realize it. They're like, well, of course, this person died or this change has happened. Like, I know it, but they're still in that denial. And it can be, you're still acting like that person is still there. Yeah. You're still acting like the situation is still going on. Right. Even though it hasn't. Right. You're still like, if you're married and you get divorced, you're still acting like your husband's going to come in there and wash those dishes. So you're not washing them. Right. Until the dishes start piling up. And it's not because you're not doing it because you're sad. It's because that's his job. Yeah. And I can see that can be something that is a little bit more insidious, and you end up not changing your routines is part of that denial, right? And with anger, something I always like to point out too with my clients is anger. Everybody hates anger. Man, they're like, everybody's angry with anger.
Yes, they're like, why am I so angry? I don't want to be angry. I'm like, it's normal.
Anger moves you forward. I tell everybody. It moves you. Anger moves you forward because you're asking these questions. Why me? Why did this happen? Why? Right. And you need those answers before you can move forward. And so I'm like, anger is like the little propeller for you. So love anger. Anger's great. The sadness, and the depression. We want to talk. At one point, I think we're going to get to that, about the difference between just the sadness and the actual depression.
Yes. And that's another one that's obviously really tricky.
Yeah. And I think we'll get to that one later. But with the sadness can kind of help you release so much of it. It's like that anger moves you forward and then you're releasing it. And like, okay. I can feel a little bit more okay right now. And that deal making, we all have to go through that.
Absolutely.
The deal making is so hard. Like, well, is there an option that maybe we can go back? I feel like deal making and denial end up being so closely related. Because you have a little bit of denial with that deal making. Right. Like, oh no, there's a chance that this is going to come back, or this is going to be back in the same situation. So let me try to make a deal.
Exactly.
Before we get to the acceptance. And also, can you talk a little bit about, is this a one and done situation?
Wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
It's not a one and done situation. And I think the biggest education piece, again, of what I talk to patients about initially is these stages are not linear, right? There's no guarantee that you will just like hit, 1 through 5 and then like, whew, good. I've gone through all these. I'm good to go, right? They do come and go, right? And there will be times where anger comes up again a year or two later, right? Like, I'm still really pissed off about this or whatever, right? Those feelings are going to come and go. Now, obviously processing them, working towards some kind of resolution, right? Whether that's with a therapist, whether that's journaling these things, whether that's really just being, self-aware and introspective. There's lots of ways you can navigate these things, but I think that's what's going to help move through these things. But one and done, I don't know. No.
Yeah, so I've always heard it's like waves and it'll come back and
seasons and all of those things. Absolutely. The biggest question, I don't know if you guys get this a lot, but the biggest question people come to me with after typically a death is, how long will this last? And I'm like, ooh, yeah, tell me when you find out. I don't know.
Yeah, you get the answer to that one. Like, they make lots of money, all right? Like, let us know. Because then we can just tell everybody about it and they'll be great. But no. It's everybody's different, and that's what. First of all, we should have led with this. Grief is normal.
It is normal. It is so normal.
Hey, you want to know if you're normal? You're experiencing grief. There you go.
Right. Right.
Sure.
You're normal. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So the 5 stages of grief, all those things, being angry, being sad, being in denial, deal making, all of that, and the acceptance, all of that is normal. So if you are experiencing that right now, it's okay. You're normal. As if anybody's normal. I mean,
right.
Normal.
And maybe speak to timelines. There is no timeline.
Right.
So I think that's important to emphasize. When am I going to get over this? And I tell patients just flat out, you're not.
It changes you.
I like how you said moving forward, not moving
you'll
on.
get around it. I had
Yes,
someone
yes.
very wise. I met this colleague years ago. He had lost a wife and a baby in a car wreck tragically. Oh. And I thought,
Yeah.
I
just thought,
how are you standing? Was kind of my thought. It
Yeah.
had been years and years. And he said something to me that and this was 20-some, this is a long time ago I ran into him. He said something that's always stuck with me. And I tell my patients now, he said, you'll never get over it, but I get around it. And I thought that was brilliant. Mm-hmm. And I tell my patients that you're not going to get over the loss of, that person, that dream, that idea, but you're going to get around it. Mm-hmm. It'll always be with you. And maybe it'll be dormant at times. So you're feeling joy, you're going about life, and it'll crop back in a year later or something.
That's
and
that acceptance when you're going.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Acknowledge it, confront it, walk in it, and you'll get around it. So I think that was a brilliant thing. He said that has always stuck with me. And coming from, who was I to question? Here I was just brand new out of school trying to learn things, and he was training me, and he had lost so traumatically, so tremendously. So that's sunk with me. That's stuck with me.
So first of all, I want to say with the dormant, you were saying like it can be dormant, and I was saying that's kind of like that acceptance stage when you're not feeling that all the time and you're moving on, and I'm feeling okay. Sure. I'm not thinking about it right now. That's more your acceptance, but it's still there. It's still like part of those stages. Yeah. And it can come back again. So when is it though, Susan, that we really need to start saying, okay, this is something more than just normal grief? When is this something that we need to go, call up Connection to Recovery and be like, hey, we need some telehealth help with our grief, which you should definitely look us up, Google Connection. Is it connectiontorecovery.com?
Connectiontorecovery.com.
Connectiontorecovery.com. And then that way you can contact one of us.
And 2 is TO. Right, spell out TO, connectiontorecovery.com, TO.
Okay. And we have several other people at Connection to Recovery too. How many are on our team now?
I think there's not including me, 10 or 11 therapists right now.
Yeah, we've got
several. Which is so crazy.
We've just been booming and growing so fast. That's why we're kind of like, how many? Okay.
That's awesome.
So, So if you don't like one of us, you can pick somebody else.
That's
okay?
Right.
It'll be all right.
Choices,
it'll be fine.
Male and female, with a variety of backgrounds.
Yes. Anyway, so how do we know we need to contact Connection to Recovery?
Again, I never put a timeline. Well, if you're still sad after 6 months, no,
Yeah,
nothing like that. I think, the obvious ones would be, hey, I'm starting to have thoughts about self-harm. I don't want to be in this world anymore without him or her or that thing that all the things Amanda highlighted. And we're having thoughts, whether it's, passive or just a thought and a thought, what can I do to not be here? So any thoughts of self-harm or harm to anyone else, like maybe you lost a loved one tragically and you really want to get revenge, and it's just sitting in there. It's not going away.
So you're saying if I go through a divorce and I want to slap my ex-husband, I need to get therapy for that?
If you can't let that go at some point and you're in a constant state, let's fast forward, say, a year. I'm just putting a random timeline, and you're just sitting in that anger and resentment. And it's okay
like
to
I'm
have...
plotting the way that I'm going to come over to his house and just go...
have those feelings and thoughts, but it's when it interferes with our daily function too.
Okay.
Meaning, I'm chronically late at work, or I barely got through work today. I mean, I'm not talking about an isolated day here and there where this has become more the norm than not.
Right.
So self-care gets neglected. Regular responsibilities, tending to our children, just tending to the house, paying bills, and we're just finding ourselves consistently kind of falling short in those areas. And again, I'm not talking about a day here and there and it was a rough week, I couldn't get everything done. I'm talking about a pattern.
Yeah.
And it's starting to impact loved ones. It's impacting your well-being, your whether it's your physical, well, both probably physical, emotional, mental, and then other people are impacted by it. Like, oh, I had to cook dinner again. Mom won't get out of bed. So
Right.
things like our regular to-dos, responsibilities are becoming harder and harder.
Right.
And I mean, if you just find yourself sitting with those thoughts of slapping someone, and it's daily, you're visualizing this, we might need to take a look at this anger. And what it comes down to when you ask, okay, when is it time to get help? And I would say anytime. Sometimes I do agree it can be extremely raw and it's not the right time. But, just generally speaking, it's always a good time.
Yeah.
Because something's happened. You need the support in my mind, and I'll say need. Who doesn't need support?
Absolutely.
So I would say anytime. But the other stuff, if it's impacting our day-to-day function and not in a positive way, you might want to reach out and get that assessed.
Right. So part of this, though, is like that, and you spoke to this, but I just want to put definite words to this, is about the difference that we were talking about, the difference between like depression and just the sadness part of that grief. Like, how do we tell the difference if, like, we have somebody who we're friends with and we can see that they're going through grief and we're like, is this just the sadness or is this actual depression? Is this somebody that maybe we should call something about, or, like, obviously there's the suicidal thoughts.
Sure.
There's the thoughts of harming themselves. But one of the other things to kind of expand on that too is like, are they thinking all the time about the grief dealing with, like, the subject of the grief? Like, if it's a death, which is just the most common and just easiest for us to visualize most of the time, is like, okay, I can't get so-and-so out of my head, and that makes me sad. Or is it, I'm just sad all the time about everything, like everything makes me sad. And it's not focused on that person.
Sure.
Like, I would say that's whenever it's more of like, this is depression versus this is the sadness part of the grief. In just general, when you're just talking to somebody, because they're probably not going to sit there and tell you all these other things. They might tell you, hey, I'm having a hard time sleeping.
Right.
I'm not getting any sleep because I keep thinking about losing somebody. Well, that's grief. That's sadness. And it might get to the point where, if that lack of sleep is bothering their day-to-day life, they're not taking care of the kids, they're not, taking care of themselves, then they need help with that. But if they aren't getting any sleep and they don't know why, and they're being super anxious and everything's building up, then that's more of the depression, right?
It's so complex. I don't know if you want
Do you want me to answer?
Yeah, go
ahead.
for it.
Whichever.
The way I try to approach it and talk about it is, does it really, really matter, right? I mean, it does to some degree, right? Like in terms of diagnosis, and there's a criteria for major depressive disorder. So yes, it does matter, right? But if we're having the symptoms, I prefer just to treat the symptoms that we're having, right? Instead of necessarily teasing out if it's grief. And now obviously, right, if it's grief and you're not able to do your daily things for over a year, the DSM does say things about this, right? Like there are certain criteria. But like you said, the potential insomnia or the anxiety or things like that, those are symptoms that we can treat in and of themselves, right? And yes, to a certain extent, I think it is helpful, obviously, to get to the bottom of them. But I think we just take what that is and kind of go from there, right? We may not always know what the diagnosis is. It's rare that we know, like, right, day one.
Yes, if somebody
right?
walks in the first session and they're like, have a blinking red light on their face that says, hey, it's depression.
It's depression. I mean, wouldn't that be nice?
It would be great.
Right? I'm like, I know where to go with this. But I think so often we treat those symptoms and kind of gain more information. And that's the way I approach it, grief versus depression. I mean, what are your thoughts?
You know, just to circle back to my humble beginnings with connection to recovery, with addiction and alcoholism and, you know, families, I really, my side of that, you know, with other therapists at the time who would love to work directly with the addict or the alcoholic, mine was with the families. Mm-hmm. And they would ask me, hey, I don't know, is his drinking or her drinking a problem? I'd say, well, the fact that you're asking, it's a problem.
Yeah.
And let's get you help. Whether it's true alcoholism or true addiction, you're talking to me saying you're troubled by it. So it's a problem.
Yeah.
And so I would say similar, you know, not obviously the things, they're not identical, grief and addiction and alcoholism, although they overlap quite a bit. If you're coming to me and saying, I'm thinking about him or her all the time, then it's a problem.
Yeah.
Then you should, circle back to the question, you know, when do you get help? If you think it's a problem, then come get help. It's a problem. Right. And whether it's complicated or uncomplicated, unresolved grief, it's in your head, it's troubling you, so it's worth talking about.
Agreed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So we don't, whatever the label or just to speak to what Amanda's saying, I totally agree. Hey, this is your issue, let's talk. I don't care if it's in the DSM and it's that F code or whatever. You have a problem because you identify it as a problem. Right. Let's talk. It's troubling you. And it may be that others are saying, you're doing great. You're over this. You're doing great. And you're thinking, oh no, I still think about slapping him constantly. Mm-hmm. So we need to talk. But I mean, I hope that makes sense that as long as you see it as a problem, then let's talk.
Yeah. Yeah. And it might be, too, that whenever you come to counseling, all right, so the first time, no, we're not going to slap you with a diagnosis. No. With the first visit, no, we won't, okay, just saying. But, you know, say you come one time and you talk about it, or you come 2 times and you talk about it, and you're fine.
Excellent point.
And it's not a problem for you anymore. You got it off your chest, and you're feeling better. If you're, as she said, if it's not bothering you, then it's not bothering us. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, like, and maybe you learn you have some education on it. Maybe you learn some coping tools. Maybe you learn a little bit more about yourself, you know, so that you can take that later on.
Yeah. Because every once in a while we drop nuggets of wisdom. Right. Not too much, but every once in a while.
We try.
You know, and that can help out. So, we're about ready to wrap up here. And so, finally, I wanted to say, like, July 16th is whenever that new hotline number comes out for mental health across the nation, and it's 988. So I'm not exactly sure what date this is coming out, but I know it's going to be pretty close to July 16th. Mm-hmm. If you need help before that comes out, you can Google your local mental health authority. You can Google that wherever you're at, no matter what part of the nation. Local mental health authority, and you can find a crisis number, because I promise you they have a crisis number. So that's if you ever feel like hurting yourself or hurting somebody else, and that's more of a in the moment kind of thing if you're needing something that's, you know, after hours. But if it's during hours in your state of Texas, please give us a call or look us up at connectiontorecovery.com. All right, anything else, ladies?
No, that's great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes.